Has Heidegger seen to our guidance in a peculiar, in a manner with a peculiarly sagacious sense to it, in such a way that he wants us to, as it were, lose our senses, but remain with our sense of so-called steadfast resoluteness in a certain direction. I think in a somewhat light example of a cat which had a GPS put into its collar, and its many cats were treated this way in a study to see what the habits of felines are, of house cats, domesticated cats. One of them, the family went away for 2 weeks on vacation, and after about a week, it jutted out in a very straight rectilinear path, straight line, as though between 2 points, some 3 miles or so, through a densely populated city area to the house where that family had formerly lived. From where did this sense of direction come? So yeah, one could posit that it had to do with the magnetic pole or something like that, but I don't think that's not accurate, and the cat's brain couldn't be shown to be having this kind of ability. How does the cat know how to do it? How does anyone know how to get anywhere? But that's only an analogy, because we're trying to go back behind, as it were, and even the phrase "back behind" is misleading. Something more than that. So, what are these considerations we're making in this approach to this Sino-Occidental harmonizing, as it were, or juxtaposition, in order to understand one side better through the mirror of the other side? Or what is it that we're even doing here? Amazingly, and somewhat formidably, in a formidable manner, Isaiah Berlin says the following: the greatest single shift in the consciousness of the West, and this is what he says about so-called romanticism. Reading this essay, and romanticism comes, one must remember, at about the same time as the rise of what Jaspers says is, in Jaspers, who has studied the Chinese text in the original language, has studied Sanskrit texts in the original language, who has made this great study on the axial age, which is greatly weighted as being of supreme importance by many anthropologists today. Understands the technological modernity as of equal importance to the discovery of fire by, in fact, by beings that long preceded the modern thinking being, the human being. Neanderthals had fire 1 million years ago or so. So far as I understand, in pits found in the area that we now call China, and perhaps at not so remote a date, but still in a comparable remoteness in India and in other places. So in this essay by Lovejoy, where he goes from this Western idea of the great praise of symmetry, all the way to Finnegal's cave, where these marvelous stream passes under these basalt pillars. This marvelous ocean stream near Scotland, way up in the north, demonstrating the great reverence for the symmetrical and for these kind of mathematical patterns, which has followed Western thinking for 2,000 years or more, at least since the time of those students of mathematics, which worship mathematics long before Plato in the 4th century, to this Chinese sense of the Wen-Ren bonsai, as it were, the scholarly gardening, the feng shui, of course, and other such things that don't operate on the same principles. How are we to approach China here? So the one approach I want to make, which will be the most rigorous in terms of philosophic exactitude, will be through Nietzsche and Heidegger. But also around that, there's a more, remembering Isaiah Berlin was one of the great scholars of ideas, historians of ideas in the world. What he says is very elucidating, and also in some more general sense, because the issue, so we don't know exactly how we're approaching this, and then we ask, what kind of problem are we dealing with here when we try to compare the West with the East, or say specifically a certain part of the West with China, for instance, with China, which has been much more affected by, even though, yeah, it's Martin Scorsese recently, not that long ago, made this movie about the Jesuits in Japan, but I think in China, as one can see from the Chinese historians, China was much more open to receive Western ideas, and the West was certainly very open and joyously undertook many Chinese forms, including, as Lovejoy brings out, the English love of gardening in some of its peculiar forms. So Heidegger says again to approach. So we don't know how we're supposed to approach this. Is it the Chinese Dasein and let's say the English-speaking Dasein, the current dominant Dasein, the Western Dasein, the German-speaking Dasein? What Dasein are we talking about, and what does even Dasein mean here? We don't actually even know what Dasein means. So we're in this position, like I think of the phrase of Hermann Hesse from his Damien, where he's, I think it may be a quote from Goethe, where he's saying, man will seldom swim before he's able to. Why should he? He's a creature of the land. So we don't know how to swim here. And therefore, what I said at the beginning is, as Heidegger sagaciously made a way for us here, that prepared the way. And are we able to follow it? Can we test ourselves in our ability to follow it? Heidegger's critique of Nietzsche at all fair? It seems to be, but it depends on whether we're willing to, as it were, like that. Also, I think of that moment in Kafka where Kafka advises the mouse to change its direction and walk into the mouth of the cat. We may have to change our direction, and instead of attempting, as Agamben says, Derrida is attempting to make this break that's shown in Dasein into something democratic by, he shows this in detail, which I haven't grasped sufficiently, but I will prime myself in it further and think it through further. He says that in this break in Dasein, where we have on the one side um, being in a certain sense, and on the other side, the word that goes with being, and that the word that goes with being, this is, say, the phusis nomos break, let's gloss it that way, that the phusis nomos break as the Anfang, or the as Heidegger understands it, the Anfang that is still unfolding, which is constantly with us, which is not in a way temporal. Um, this is also an archon, as Agamben says it, a ruler, and it's giving us this command. On the one side, there's something along the line of the something, and on the other side there is the word as the command, which goes along with justice. So there's truth and justice, and Agamben interestingly says that if you kind of stay on, he doesn't say it this way, but the way I hear it is, if you stay on this side of it, which I think is sort of the non-Heideggerian side, the side which isn't going towards, let's say, the inception, the new inception. In other words, the Anfang, which is still unfolding, is the first inception, which is still holding sway over us. But if you were to go, instead of trying to go to the new inception, you were to work within what's here, then you can either go, according to Agamben, to the anarchy side, which I think is the side which favors the first something, or the democratic side, where is supposedly the side Derrida is taking, according to Agamben. And there's these two ways, but with Heidegger, we want to, instead, it's like we're going to the mouth of the cat instead of trying to save ourselves. So that is much too vaguely given here to be adequate. It's just for the beginning, for this one recording, we're doing just a little bit of what Leo Strauss called the sort of disgracefully inadequate, what did he call that, by the name of the artistic movement, like Van Gogh, the impressionistic. We're making an impressionistic move. It's not adequate to philosophic rigor, which really shows us what we want to be thinking when we're talking about these things, but we're only gliding over them. Somebody who has thought through these Agamben more rigorously could, just through the impressionistic saying, get something out of it, right? But if we haven't got the first step in that respect, then we're it's not adequate to us. It's we're just producing almost just some kind of prattle. But so far as we're aimed at getting the more exact account, we're perhaps in the right direction, but we don't know that. And then, of course, the other consideration is, why do we have to approach things through all this rigor? We don't exactly know why, and are we actually making a mistake in saying, what kind of problem is this, comparing East with West, comparing whatever it is that we've grown into, whoever it is that we are, whatever kind of Dasein we are, with whatever kind of Dasein China is. There's all kinds of, are we superimposing? Certainly the greater notion, which comes back to the accusation that Heidegger is racist by Dugin, but it seems like Dugin is insufficiently self-conscious of his own position when he says that, is that if it's true that we are a certain kind of Dasein, then how can we possibly avoid approaching China through what we are? But we want to look at that in much more exact questions. So one, that logic doesn't exist in China, that it was unrecognized by the Jesuits. When the Jesuits first brought it in, the best Chinese scholars who learned the Western languages, who studied the books such as the Port Royal Logic, the great logic text of the time, put it on a shelf by itself and said, "There's nothing like this amongst us." Then, after 200 years or so, everybody started saying, "Well, the Chinese already had logic, blah blah blah. It's like this, it's like that." And then you get to this question of this peculiarity of certain subjects, which is incomparable, and you kind of break over into the towards what in the negative sense would be a kind of leveling, where you see the thing in everywhere. In the same way, Isaiah Berlin says the scholars of Romanticism see Romanticism everywhere in texts of just as they see the novel everywhere. In the 250 AD, Roman novelist shows signs of Romanticism, and this is given as evidence by those who say Romanticism is something of a elementaren Gedanken, this sort of elementary thought. Are there elementary thoughts? What does that mean? Are there principles from which every thinking being or every human being, we don't even know exactly where we're starting, Kant speaks of the sentient beings or the thinking beings, all kinds of problems open up there. How are we to sort through all this? Or are we talking about human beings in biological terms? Or are we talking about human beings in the sense Heidegger opens it up, where he understands the first being to raise the eyes with Thales or student Anaximander? From where are we starting in this genetic circle? Where's our starting point? I should stop here. In the next recording, I'm going to make a great effort to go closely to things we can understand directly and way up in connection to Nietzsche, Heidegger, and such questions as it doesn't make sense to say there's this elementary idea, nature, and that it existed also in China, but that China just had a different take on it than did the Greeks or than did the Jewish tradition. We need some manner of approach where we can begin the analysis, and I try to use Heidegger with Dasein as Dasein is elucidated through his criticism of Nietzsche, especially in this second essay on the use and abuse of history.